Inside a cardboard drawer in a university museum basement, a carved piece of river cane sat for 80 years, waiting to blow apart the accepted timeline of the first people in the Ozarks. The story everyone was taught is wrong. The first Ozark settlers were not primitive latecomers. They were here thousands of years earlier than the record admits, and for decades, the proof sat buried by mistake. In the early 1930s, the University of Arkansas Museum raced a rival New York institution to strip as many Ozark Bluff shelters as it could, as fast as it could, and that race is the reason the real timeline stayed hidden for almost a century. Then, in 2011, a volunteer named Jim Reese was working through boxes of uncatalogued material from that same rushed dig when he pulled out a two-chambered flute, an instrument nobody had listed, dated, or even recognized, sitting quietly in a drawer since before his own grandparents were born. That flute is where this story starts. It is not where it ends. The flute came out of a bluff shelter, one of the driest, strangest kinds of archaeological sites in North America. Bluff shelters are not caves in the dramatic sense. They are shallow sandstone and limestone overhangs tucked into the bluffs of Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma, and most of them are bone dry. That dryness is the whole story. In wet ground, cloth rots in a generation, wood splits and vanishes. But under a dry overhang, a woven sandal can survive 9,000 years. A seed can survive 2,000. A flute carved from river cane can survive 1,000 years without a single note being lost to decay. Archaeologists have identified more than 2,000 of these shelters, and inside them, they found something almost nowhere else on this continent preserves: the actual textures of ancient daily life. Baskets, bags, cordage knotted by hand, footwear stitched from yucca-like leaves. This is where the official story starts to earn its prestige. This is also where it starts to crack. The variety is what surprises people first. Sandals woven from rattlesnake master leaves, tailored deer hide moccasins, atlatls with the original hide bindings still wrapped around the shaft. And then, in one Harrington excavated bag that should have held food, something else entirely: beaver teeth, bird bone, and chunks of worked hematite and clear crystal, wrapped together with no obvious practical use at all. Not a meal, not a toolkit. Something closer to a ceremony, sealed in cloth and forgotten for centuries. One of those shelters carries the same name as this story's title. Indian Rockhouse Cave, inside what is now Buffalo National River, is a limestone overhang built around its own natural skylight, with a spring that still runs across the shelter floor. University of Arkansas Museum crews dug there in the 1930s, and again in a smaller pass in the 1970s, pulling out stone tools, a child burial, and a stored cache of corn cobs and seeds, later radiocarbon dated to around 1,300 years old. The site has been protected inside the national park system since 1972, which means it is safe today. It does not mean the excavation that first defined it was, because the label attached to these people was never sophisticated. It was bluff dweller, a single, flattened, vanished race, frozen in time, credited with almost nothing beyond simple survival. That label came from two men. Mark Harrington, working for the High Foundation in the 1920s, dug at least 24 shelters and shipped the finds east. Samuel Dellinger, curator of the University of Arkansas Museum, ran a faster, bigger operation from 1931 to 1934. Crews working up to 85 sites, funded by a Carnegie grant, racing to keep the material in state before Harrington's team got to it first. Even the Smithsonian was in the field around the same years, working its own Arkansas cave sites. 3 separate institutions, chasing the same ground, all moving faster than the science could keep up with. Neither man was trained the way modern archaeologists are trained. Dellinger was a zoologist. His field supervisors were college students. And what they were digging through wasn't one culture, it was 9,000 years of overlapping human occupation, compressed into a few feet of dirt. That's the detail that should stop you. 9,000 years and a handful of vertical feet. Paleo-Indian hunters, archaic foragers, woodland farmers, Mississippian traders, all of it pressed together in layers that a trained eye can separate, and an untrained crew moving fast, funded to produce results, cannot. So when Dellinger's teams pulled up spear points from one level and woven bags from another, they didn't see 3,000 years of technological change. They saw one people, one race, one story, small enough to fit in a museum case and a chapter heading. The name stuck. It shows up in textbooks for decades. And it built something worse than a wrong date. It built a stereotype, one that quietly fed the old, ugly caricature of Ozark Hill people as backward and cut off from the world. That caricature had a long shelf life. It shaped how the region saw itself, and how the outside world saw the region for the better part of a century, all resting on excavation notes. Nobody had the tools to check. Here's the part that makes it sting. While Dellinger's crews were writing that myth, they were also burying the evidence that would eventually destroy it. Field notes were thin. Site records were vague. That's exactly how Jim Reese's flute went. 80 years without a name, not lost, not stolen, just never actually examined closely enough by the people who dug it out of the ground. Nobody in the 1930s wrote down what they'd actually found. And if one flute could disappear inside a drawer for 8 decades before a volunteer finally spotted it, the question that should be keeping curators up at night is obvious. What else is still sitting in those boxes, unread and undated? Looting made it worse. Long before professional archaeologists arrived, and for decades after, private collectors tore through shelters, scrambling the exact layers that could have told this story properly the first time. In 2015, a man in Crawford County was convicted for illegally digging sites inside the Ozark St. Francis National Forest. He forfeited more than 2,800 artifacts, paid over $12,000 in restitution, and got 5 years probation. That wasn't 100 years ago, that was recent. It's part of why the exact locations of most bluff shelters are legally withheld from public record today. Not bureaucratic secrecy, but the only thing standing between these sites and total destruction. So the accepted story, simple, primitive, isolated people waiting for agriculture and complexity to arrive from somewhere else, sounds tidy. It's also exactly the kind of story rushed 1930s excavation would produce. And it's exactly the kind of story modern testing was built to break. The tool that changed everything is AMS radiocarbon dating, accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that needs only a tiny sliver of material, sometimes a single thread or a fragment of cane, to count the decaying carbon atoms left inside it and calculate almost exactly how long ago that plant or animal died. No more dating an object by its position in a jumbled pit, or by what layer it happened to be sitting near when a college student pulled it out in 1932. Now, researchers could date the object itself, directly, on its own terms, and the object didn't care what the old excavation notes had assumed. At Breckenridge Shelter in Carroll County, that method hit a Hempstead spear point that had been sitting under collapsed roof fall, sealed directly onto bedrock, about as clean an archaeological context as you can ask for. The radiocarbon result, 8,720 years before present, plus or minus 30 years. Calibrated, that's a calendar age of roughly 9,700 to 9,550 years old. It is, according to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, the oldest dated projectile point form ever recovered from a rock shelter in the state. That single point pushes verified human presence in these shelters back into the tail end of the Ice Age, a full Paleo-Indian tradition sealed under stone, dated with a precision Dellinger's generation could never have imagined. Some researchers push it further still. A 2012 re-excavation at Breckenridge argued the lowest layer could represent a Younger Dryas era encampment, hunters using the site during one of the last serious cold snaps of the Ice Age, working with the same Dalton and Packard-style tools found at comparable early sites across the state line in Missouri. That reading is still debated, but even the cautious version of the story adds thousands of years onto what the old textbooks claimed, and it isn't an isolated fluke either. At Arnold Research Cave in Missouri, AMS testing on the same style of woven footwear pushed sandal use back roughly 8,300 years. A different shelter, a different state, the same deep chronology showing up again. That result alone should have been enough to rewrite the textbook chapter. It didn't stop there. It got stranger. At Marble Bluff Shelter, excavators found a storage crevice cut into the back wall, holding twined bags packed with seeds, chenopod, marsh-elder, sunflower, squash. Testing dated the cache to roughly 3,400 years old. And these weren't wild plants somebody happened to be gathering. The seed coat showed the thinning that marks domestication, deliberate generation over generation selection of a crop. Published research recognizes this as part of an independent domestication event in the mid-continent, meaning these communities were breeding their own food crops more than 1,000 years before maize ever reached the region from Mesoamerica. The primitive people waiting for agriculture to arrive. Narrative doesn't survive that. These weren't waiting. They were already farming on their own terms with their own crops. Then there's the bag from Eden's Bluff, the one holding roughly a liter of chenopod seeds, radiocarbon dated to about 2,000 years old, meticulously twined and knotted shut. And the textile record behind it. Researcher Elizabeth Horton built a chronology from 17 radiocarbon dates, spanning 300 separate fabric fragments pulled from these shelters. And the result is a continuous weaving tradition, running roughly 3,000 years, twining, coiling, pattern cordage, evolving technique after technique, generation after generation. That's not a stagnant, isolated culture. That's a textile industry with a memory. And the testing hasn't stopped at radiocarbon. Researchers are now working to sequence ancient DNA directly from these same seed caches, trying to trace, generation by generation, exactly how a wild chenopod plant became a crop that people bred on purpose. That work is still unfolding. But it's aimed at the same question everything else in this shelter keeps circling back to: how early and how deliberately did these communities start shaping the world around them? And at Saltpeter Cave, a survey excavation in the late 1960s cut through 14 feet of stratified deposit, layer after layer, tested with 42 separate radiocarbon samples, and cross-checked against roughly 450 diagnostic stone tools pulled from those same layers, representing more than 9,000 years of continuous, trackable human use of a single shelter, 14 feet holding 9,000 years. Every layer a chapter Dellinger's cruise had flattened into one. So look at what the evidence actually says, side by side with the label that survived a century in textbooks. Point technology going back nearly 10,000 years. A domesticated crop complex bred in-house more than 3,000 years ago. A weaving tradition with 3,000 years of continuous technical evolution. A flute carved with enough skill to survive as a functioning instrument for 1,000 years. None of that fits inside the word primitive. The evidence doesn't just update the old story. It dismantles the reason the old story existed in the first place. The vanished Bluff dweller race wasn't a discovery about ancient people. It was a mistake about them. Manufactured by speed, funding pressure, and a total absence of the dating technology that would have told the real story from day one. But before you assume the record is now clean, there's a live discrepancy still sitting in plain sight, and it involves the most famous rock art shelter in the region. At Petite Jean's Rockhouse Cave, more than 100 pictographs cover the sandstone, red pigment figures, abstract markings, a life-sized paddlefish beside what looks like a woven fish trap. State archaeologists, working with radiocarbon and stylistic analysis, attribute the panel to the first half of the 1600s, plausibly linked to the historic Tanico province that Hernando de Soto's expedition passed through. But walk through the tourist material and you'll find dates all over the map. Claims the art is 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, over 500 years old. Those numbers were never confirmed by peer review. They're popular guesses stacked on top of real science, and the gap between them is still unresolved on the ground today. Some researchers push the reversal even further. Coiled basketry techniques found in Ozark shelters closely resemble weaving traditions from the Great Basin and the Southwest, a similarity that hints at archaic period contact across enormous distances, though it's not proof of direct exchange. Shell, copper, and cotton recovered from shelter and mound sites point toward trade networks, reaching all the way to Spiro Mounds in eastern Oklahoma, one of the great hubs of the ancient southeastern world. None of this proves a pre-Clovis timeline. There's no verified evidence humans were in the Ozarks before the Paleo-Indian era, and that claim should be treated as unsupported wherever it surfaces online. But it does mean the real picture is the opposite of isolated. These weren't hill people cut off from history. They were plugged into it. Which raises the uncomfortable modern question: who controls what's left of them? If the old dates hold, the prestige stays exactly where it's always sat, with the institutions that wrote the first version of the story. If the new dates hold, credit for the region's earliest, most sophisticated farming and weaving traditions belongs somewhere else entirely, with the descendants of the people who actually did the work, not the museums that cataloged it a century after the fact. The bulk of the Dellinger and Harrington collections still sit in institutional storage at the University of Arkansas Museum, which holds more than 7 million cataloged objects across its collections, at the National Museum of the American Indian, and incomparable southeastern holdings at Harvard's Peabody Museum, all gathered under the 1920s and 30s methods that would not pass an ethics review today. For decades, that material sat largely unexamined, unrepatriated, and in some cases, like the flute, unrecognized for what it even was. That's not a small administrative problem. It's a question of who gets to hold the physical record of a people's history and who gets to decide when or whether it gets returned. That's beginning to change. The Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations, whose ancestral ties to this landscape run through the same shelters, have been working with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey on active NAGPRA repatriation. By 2024, the survey's own NAGPRA coordinator reported that nearly 2,000 ancestral items had already been made available for return, a number that keeps climbing as more of the old collection gets re-examined. In 2025, the survey secured a $150,000 federal grant specifically to fund staff processing ancestral remains and associated items for return, running through 2027. The survey's director has called the work necessarily collaborative. That is a careful phrase for what it actually means: a slow, deliberate handover of authority over the past, from museum shelves back to the descendants of the people those shelves were built from. And the looting hasn't stopped either. It's simply moved underground, into private hands, competing with archaeologists and tribal nations for whatever hasn't already been dug up, misfiled, or quietly forgotten. Every unlabeled box in every collection is now a live question. Every artifact recovered under Dellinger's rushed 1930s timeline needs to be re-examined before anyone can say with confidence what it actually proves. The myth took 100 years to build. Unwinding it, one radiocarbon date at a time, is going to take just as long. Somewhere in that museum basement, the drawer is still there. So is the flute, the one Jim Reese pulled out in 2011, the one that sat silent for 80 years before anyone understood what they were holding. It looks the same as it did at the start of the story, but the meaning underneath it has shifted. Out in the Ozarks, the shelter it came from still stands too, dust drifting through the light gap in the roof, a spring still tracing the same path across the stone floor it followed 9,000 years ago. The corn cache from Indian Rockhouse Cave is cataloged now. The flute is cataloged now. The real question is how many others in that basement still aren't? Nobody has finished checking the rest of the boxes. The truth sat in that drawer for 8 decades before anyone noticed, and there is no reason to believe it was the only one.